Hello everyone again, this is Mark Bennett. Welcome to my channel. For this episode, we're going to interview a really good friend of mine. I've known him 30 plus years, since I was roughly about 8 years old. He started driving before I did. We're going to go over some of the changes in the trucking industry from when he started driving to today. So I'd like you guys to meet a real good friend of mine, Marcus Washington.
Hello, America. Hello, fellow drivers.
So, Marcus, tell us, what year did you start driving truck?
1989.
1989. Wow. So you basically 35 years, roughly.
5 years in the business.
Yeah. What made you decide to drive truck in 1989?
Well, after I got out of the Air National Guard, I needed something to do, so I thought at the time they were offering this Western Pacific Truck School. They were offering grants to go to school and learn how to drive a truck. So I went ahead and took one, and my first job was hauling tomatoes up and down the San Joaquin Valley.
So you were hauling tomatoes for WTI, I believe it was?
No, it's called Tri-Transport. That's where I first started.
Oh, okay. Tri-Transport. WTI does the same thing out of Fresno.
Right.
And you started your career in Fresno, California, I take it.
Well, Fireball.
Fireball.
Fresno County, you might as well say.
Okay. Now, after that, how long did you haul the tomatoes?
I did that till 1994.
Till 1994. And then from 1994, what did you do when you stopped hauling tomatoes?
After that, I went driving up and down California locally with dry vans, and then the next year I started going over the road in 1995.
Okay, now, when you start over the road, who did you drive for?
When I started over the road, I drove for a place called Cannon Express. They're not any in business any longer, but they used to do, well, they were pretty much basically they did all Walmart freight. And they were right there next, just in the next city, Springdale, Arkansas.
Yeah, that right there.
It was a long way from California just to start.
Yeah, I worked for CCC, Carco Corporation, just down the street.
Same town. And so, how many years apart? About 5, 6 years apart. We started in the same town, driving over the road.
Yeah, roughly. Now, there's a lot of folks that watch my channel and look at my videos that have been asking me certain questions about trucking. Some of these folks have just started driving within the last year or two. Others have been driving 5 or 6 years. Okay. Come on, baby. I'll edit this out somehow. Okay. Now, as I was saying, some have been just started driving their trucking career. Others have been driven 4 or 5 years. Now, explain to some of these newer drivers some of the things that we had to go through, and even you who started, I believe, roughly 8 years before I started driving. Some of the differences in driving today compared to then, as far as your hours of service, I know are a lot different now than what they were in the past.
Well, I can tell you this: it was a lot more flexible then, and there was no. Now, people had recording devices. They've had recording devices since the 40s and 50s, but those were the old. They called them tachographs, and it was a piece of paper that a needle wrote on inside of this container, and it contained a speedometer, and it just did basic things like tell you what your speed was when the truck was stopped, started. It was very basic. It wasn't anything like the electronic logs of today. So you were really, kind of on your own. You were, somebody pretty much, like, you hear the old stories. They hand you a set of keys and they give you a load and they say it needs to be here by then. I mean, it's oversimplifying it a little bit, but it was a lot simpler back then, and you had a lot more to do with the decision-making process.
Now, I see a lot of the people who watch my videos and a couple of the channels groups I'm in Facebook, they're talking about how they barely have enough hours to do this, or they need more hours to do that, or how they're running low on their 70. Well, some of these drivers, like I said, have been driving just very recently. So unlike me and you, when we started, there was no 34-hour restart. We had the 8-hour break, 10-hour driving per day, and that was basically what we went by. There was no way to reset your hours. Kind of explain that. And I know you've been driving recently, and you drove in the past. Kind of explain a little bit of the differences, in your opinion, on the 10 8-hour roll and the 11-14 with the 34 restart?
Well, the thing that gets me the most is this is something that we needed even back then, but nobody had thought of it yet. I mean, they were proposing it in Canada, but they kind of have a different set of rules. It's it's a different country, so everybody has their own way to to pass these rules. And we always said that was one of the biggest problems that we still ran up against, was running up against your 70 hours. Now, as far as each day went, we had the flexibility of taking, if you wanted to say stop for a 2-hour lunch or take a 2-hour nap because you were a little tired that day. You could do that and it wouldn't affect anything else of your driving time. It was pretty basic. You had 10 hours to drive and you had to sleep 8 hours. It did not matter how you broke that up. I mean, you couldn't break it up in, say, 75 minutes or 25 minutes. You had to go by the half hour. But at least you had the flexibility to do that. And unfortunately, they've taken that flexibility away with, I don't know who scientists they hire, but it's such a problem now, because now you're forced to do things within a certain frame of time because you can't stop, say the clock from running, and I just don't understand how this got passed. I mean, to me, there's no basis in science and there's no basis in practicality either, because this is, I found this same problem too, because the last driving job that I have, we ran strictly on electronic logs, and it just seemed like you never had enough time to make your runs, even normal 400 or 500 mile runs. It seemed like it was taking all your time to make them. It just I don't know what the solution is, but it's definitely a problem. I can see and I can understand that problem because I've done it in the past, and also I've done it with the modern electronic logs and Qualcomm and everything else.
Now, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was one of the subjects I wanted to get into in this interview. And like I said, you have a little more experience. I mean, you both do, as far as running on paper logs. Before the Qualcomm came out, where you had to find a payphone to call your dispatcher to find out what your next load was. Whereas now with the Qualcomm, everything's sent right to the truck of the driver. Now the downfall to that is to some extent they're making us do our logs on the Qualcomm, so it does take some of the flexibility out. There is a little bit, but it does take some of the flexibility out. Tell or explain, in your opinion, some of the differences, or the way it was harder in the past when we didn't have the Qualcomm. When you had to, like I said, when you had to use the phone to call your dispatcher and may have to wait an hour or so, or call back, walk from your truck in the rain to the payphone.
Well, to me, it was an inconvenience at times, but usually you would always call, you would call in the morning and say, okay, I'm so many miles down the road and I've got so much longer to go, and is that going to work? Or a lot of times, one of the things that they did have was pagers, and pagers had been around for a while. Lots of industries use them, and I found it especially, it was decent enough to have, because at least that way you would know that they wanted you to call, so you would just find the next little service station or something. But this is also back in the time when they still had good landline phone service, which you can't find a truck stop hardly anymore that has a working payphone. So, and sometimes you might still have to use it, say your phone is out of time or for whatever reason, and there's times when you have to either ask to use their phone or ask to use somebody else's cell phone. So in a way, it was inconvenient, but also that's when landlines worked better. So to me, it wasn't that big of a deal. But there was the times when you had to get out in the rain or the cold, or it was minus 35, and have to use a payphone, and then you were wishing, I wish I had a mobile phone.
That was where I was trying to go, because some of the drivers nowadays who didn't have to experience that as we did, like I said, again, they had the Qualcomm. They didn't have to worry about finding a load, because now it's given to them. When you started driving, there were a lot of times you would actually have to find a load for your company, deal with the brokers or deal with the shippers or receivers to accommodate that load. Kind of give us an example or your experience on how trucking has actually become easier with the technology of today versus the technology of yesteryear.
Yeah, as far as finding the load, yeah, there's been a dozen times when I've actually had to do that, and they didn't know the area. Most of their customers weren't in that area, so you actually had to get out and be the salesman. But in the old day, the truck driver did pretty much everything. Basically, the truck driver had a boss. I'm talking 30s, 40s. You had a boss, and the truck driver, the boss said, "I need this load of lumber taken down to Philadelphia. Once you get to Philadelphia, find something and come back, because he may be busy, he may not want to do that." But that's actually how it started. The truck driver did the driving, the loading, the unloading, and the collecting. A lot of times loads were collect, so you actually had to collect a check from someone, and then find a load on the way back. I mean, if you wanted to keep working that week, it was definitely harder. Back when I started, the Qualcomm had started coming into use, but only the bigger companies could really afford to put that in there. So it was still basically a word of mouth thing. So, I mean, to not have to do that, yeah, it's definitely, and especially TransFlow. I love TransFlow because you get paid faster, the company gets paid faster, and everybody wins. That's one of the better inventions that they've had in the last, say, 10 decade of trucking.
Okay, now we'll get to the TransFlow and the pay part, because I'm sure that's one of the areas I want to touch on as far as the pay of the past and the pay of the future. But one thing I would like to tell you, you started out hauling tomatoes, grapes, onions, basically going to the fields picking up, and then you transferred over to over the road. I know you were home almost every night doing the produce or doing the tomatoes versus being home once a month, once every couple months over the road. If you were going to give someone who was thinking about coming into the trucking industry one word of advice as far as what to look for, would you recommend trying to find something like the hauling tomatoes if they're in an area like California that does that? Or would you recommend an over-the-road job?
It depends on the person's family situation. I mean, if you've got a wife or kids at home, or even a girlfriend, and their kids that you like to be with and spend time with, definitely over the road is it's going to cause a strain on your relationships. And even if you're somebody that still lives at home, you don't, and you like seeing your parents, over the road is not going to be something that you're going to be satisfied with. I mean, I hear so many stories of, this person did it a couple of months or 30 days and then they quit. I hear so much of that from the trucking companies I go to work for. See, I'm single, so I'm prepared to do that, but it has to depend on the person's family situation. And the dog wants to be in the interview here still. Not listening very good. I would definitely recommend trying to get something local. There's lots of fine local companies. I mean, I'll tell you one right now, UPS. That's one of the biggest mistakes I ever made was not going to work for them. They're a large company. They're a very stable company. They've been around since 1908. He is not going to. I don't know why all of a sudden he wants to see everyone.
Now, when you started over the road, you went to Canon. What year was that again? 1995, I believe you said?
96.
96. Just to give the people an idea, what was the pay they were paying the over-the-road drivers in 1996?
In 1996, I thought it was pretty good.
Go, Apollo.
Yeah, I was getting paid 30 cents a mile, so I was actually with an over-the-road company that, because the average back then was about 24, 25 cents. And which made, nobody would go to work for that today, but, it's a different economy. Back then, your dollar went a little bit further. So I felt I was getting paid, fairly well.
Well, that's funny you said, because there's a lot of companies out there that start today at 30 cents with very minimal experience. So that was one of the reasons I asked you that question, was because, like I said, some people start to today, and that we're talking roughly almost 20 years later, and we got folks out here driving truck for the same rate that you were getting 20 years ago.
Oh, I agree. That's one of the biggest problems. I think people are kind of stuck in the past with that, and I don't know why. I can't put a finger on it, but that's you know, that wage is at least 15 years behind, where a person's wages need to be. Because the thing is, if somebody could guarantee me that after every time I dropped a load, I could get another one, either the next morning or that day, or at least get started on something else and keep my miles up for the week. Sure, I would work for 30 cents a mile, but nobody can guarantee that because of the fickle nature of trucking. Customers come and go, customers cancel all the time, and then you're stuck waiting 2 or 3 days for a load, and there goes your income. Because if you're getting paid by the mile, if you're not running, he is determined to steal the show.
Yes.
If you're not running, you're not making any money. Just like if you were getting paid by the hour and somebody cut your hours, say you're working in a factory, which I have experience with, then you're not going to be able to pay your bills. So it's just, I don't understand why there's such this industry-wide resistance to paying drivers more. Because I can't say it's a guarantee, but companies that pay more are going to have less turnover, and the drivers are going to be more satisfied. I don't see why that still exists today. It's still an old time. You work for me, and you pay. You take what I say I'm going to pay you, and that just doesn't work anymore. Not in today's economy.
Okay, now I want to try and give an idea to the new drivers of what it was like for us. See, nowadays, pretty much anywhere they go, the companies are going to pay for the lumpers. A lot of these companies now are paying detention time when they're detained. You got companies like Martin who are guaranteeing detention time. They're guaranteeing home time, so forth and so on. As when we started, and especially when you started, were you guaranteed your home time? Were you guaranteed, did the company guarantee they were going to pay a lumper? Or were there times when they told you that you had to unload the load yourself because of the time frame, the time frame of when you actually were driving?
I'll give you one forgettable example. I work for this company, and I'll keep them nameless because that's just kind of how a lot of the places work. Like I said, I'm the boss, and you do what I say. Well, they would give me an envelope of money. There was $100 in it, and that was supposed to cover everything from. And granted, this is when repairs were cheaper, and you could actually get a flat fix on a truck for $10 or $15 at a wayside service station or something. But that had to cover everything. And this is when I was driving locally in California, but still, we're talking 200-300 miles each way. It's still, by the end of the day, you've driven 500-600 miles. It's still a long day. And if somebody asked to, if you went to a place where you have a lumper, well, you had to either, if you didn't have enough money, then you had to get on that payphone like we talked about and call the boss, and then he would have to call them, and it would just take a whole long time. Yeah, it was definitely, it was definitely touch and go sometimes, because if you didn't have that money, or you didn't, if that wasn't a customer you went to regularly, and you say, okay, I got to bring $50 for this guy, and already have it there, it wasted a lot of your time. There was a lot of time wasted even back then.
Okay, yeah, that was one of the other things I wanted to touch on, because I've talked to a lot of the newer drivers, and I tell them they get it easier. Not easy, because it's never easy being away from the family or the relatives or the loved ones. But it's easier nowadays with the way everything works. Whereas I can remember when I drove, there was times that it was either lump the load or you're fired. Just the way it was. Companies didn't pay for lumpers back then that often.
They wouldn't pay you a good rate either.
Or they would only pay. Well, we're only gonna pay $100. If it's gonna be more than that, then you have to do it, and we'll pay you $50 to do it. So you'd have to come out of your own pocket. So now we know that you got experience hauling tomatoes and produce. We know you got experience doing dry van. What other experience have you done? Flatbed, step deck, reefers, and so forth.
I've actually done all of them.
So. What would you say out of all the different areas of driving truck was your favorite?
Step deck. It's far and away, especially equipment, especially John Deere out of I can't even think of the city now. What's the city up in northeast Iowa?
You got me. I try and stay California and back is what I try to do.
Well, anyway, but yeah, that was one of my favorites because see, it was hassle free. You went in, you told him you were picking up this tractor and this tractor or this piece of equipment. He handed you a bill of lading, you signed it. You got him. He was the only time that he might not be at the window was between 12 and 1 when he was on lunch, or else somebody would be there. It was 24-hour a day loading. He said, okay, here's the machines. They would either bring them over to you or you go over to the yard and drive them onto your flatbed, or sometimes they loaded in, there was an inside dock they had, and you put them on there, you chained them down, and then you left. It was as simple as that. Now, if every place could be like this would be a dream job, but every place has their own way they like to do things, and a lot of times it's not in favor of the driver, and that's unfortunate. If I had a choice, that's all I would do, was to drive for John Deere.
Yeah, everyone I've talked to, I've been unlucky so far. I haven't pulled no John Deere, but I have.
You have to go call them. Yeah. It's such a hassle-free place. I mean, there's no hassle. The only hassle is if you are going to give that guy a hassle. And what does he care? He's union and he's getting paid by the hour. So it wouldn't do you any good. But it does. But it's not that way. It's the way that it should be, because you're there to haul something. He's there to give you the bill of ladings. There shouldn't be any, nobody should tread on anybody else's territory.
Now, when you first started driving, your home time situation, how did the companies work?
Dubuque, Iowa, sorry.
Yeah. How did the companies work with getting you home? Or how did you get home as far as today? Because like I said, today you got companies like Martin, once again, which is a real good company. They guarantee your home time. They guarantee they'll have you home within 1 day of when you're supposed to be home. I know when I started, you would tell me you wanted to be home Friday. You may show up Monday before or the Wednesday after. You were very seldom home the day so you had to always give a big window when you wanted to do things. In the late 80s, early 90s, how was the home time decided by some of these companies that you worked for?
Well, the local jobs, you just had your regular days off. If the company didn't work, basically you didn't work. But during the ag season, it was pretty much 7 days a week. But after a couple of weeks, you would say, okay, I'm kind of tired. I need this Sunday off or this Saturday off. And I would always make sure I tried to plan it on where there was the least volume, so I know I wasn't missing out on anything. I mean, you have to be a little bit greedy, because that's how you're getting paid. Now, even though we were getting paid a percentage, which is actually one of the best ways to get paid, but as far as the over-the-road jobs, yeah, you would have to give 2 weeks notice sometimes, and they still said, well, we can't guarantee you we'll get you there on this time. And a lot of times it was always right before you wanted to get to some event, say a family birthday party or a wedding anniversary or something, or there was always a little bit after. And it was never right when you wanted it, because of the way freight is, one, but it's just that there just wasn't any how can I say it, there wasn't any benefit of the doubt given to the driver who's actually doing the miles and hauling the loads and making the money for the company. I mean, you were always there's always this opinion that you're just a hired hand. You're more than that. It's a more complicated business than that. It's still appalling at the lack of respect that drivers still get.
Yeah. Now, earlier you mentioned TransFlow earlier you mentioned TransFlow and pay. I agree with you. In my opinion, it's one of the greatest inventions or technology advances in the trucking industry. I remember, and I'm sure you remember because you started before me, when you had to U.S. mail your trips in, and you only got paid once the company received the bills. And so if the U.S. mail, or then after a while they had the trip pack boxes. Okay, but you use either way, but neither one was guaranteed overnight. It was a couple days to a week to 2 weeks, depending on the delivery service and where you dropped it. Was it the same? Was it different when you started, or give the new drivers an idea of how the pay schedule went, being that you had to drop in U.S. mail and cross your fingers that it made it in by your payroll cutoff so you can get paid the very next week, versus being able to walk into the truck stop, put your papers in a scanner, scan it, hit a couple buttons, and you're getting paid?
Well, it was just like you said, it was a hit or miss. If the mail was late or for whatever reason delayed, say it was bad weather, Christmas time, high volume mail times, it wasn't a guarantee. I mean, it was something that you always had to keep in the back of your mind. Okay, it's Friday, I'm unloading, it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I better hurry up and find a post office or a mailbox. Most truck stops back then, and again, you won't hardly find any now, but most truck stops had a U.S. mailbox, and a lot of times the pickup times would always be later because they were always in outlying areas. So there was ways that you could do it. And one of the ways that I did it, and the time it's now DHL, but Airborne Express. Now, of course, it costs you a little extra, but if I knew that I needed to get it there by, say, a Monday or a Tuesday or whatever the payroll cutoff day was, I would spend the extra and get it on Airborne Express, or I'd go to my local airport. That was back, of course, pre-2001. Unless you're going there to drop a load off, or drop somebody off as a passenger on a bobtail, I just don't mess with going to airports anymore. This is back in the day when you had the freedom to go a lot of places where they don't allow trucks anymore. Or it's just, it would just be difficult, to get in and out. But that was some of the things that I did to alleviate that, because yeah, it was definitely something you were always worried about, because if you missed that trip, it was going on next week's paycheck, whether you needed it or not.
Yeah, and there was no giving you a trip advance back then, basically.
Well, some did, but not many and not much.
Okay.
Most of the time, their limit was $50 or $100 per week.
Now, you get a lot of these newer drivers, and this is one of my main problems with the newer driver. One of the things I really dislike is you have the invention of the GPS. Now, don't get me wrong, I use a GPS. The main reason I use it is for when I'm in a city I haven't been to, which now there aren't that many that I haven't been to. But so it shows me the streets, so I have an advanced warning of when I have to turn, versus being in there at midnight and having to make a last minute, whip around the corner because you're seeing your road late. But they're not teaching these guys how to read a map. Okay, and I'm not sure if some of these folks realize what it was like for you and me before the GPS came out. How much easier, in your opinion, has that made the trucker's life, or has it made some truckers, not all, lazier by not looking at the map to make sure that's where they need to go?
I'm just going to be honest with you. I believe it's made, I've seen more trucks underride underpasses than I've ever seen before. In my day, back, in the late 80s, early 90s, I never seen it that much. Even though there was times when I was caught somewhere I didn't need to be because it just wasn't on the map. But that's something that you always have to try to plan ahead, whether you have GPS or not. And to rely on that too much, first of all, a lot of GPS systems are made for automobiles only. They don't tell you that on the package. They just want you to buy the nice, shiny little $300-400 toy and say, well, look what I've got. But you always have to keep a map with you because, what if your battery goes out, or you don't have a power source? Say your truck's in the shop and you're trying to find something, you have to still be able to look at a map and say, this is where I need to go. And you can trace yourself. Most major cities are represented in maps. Smaller cities maybe not so much. You can always ask somebody. The one thing that I always did when I was lost in a city, I asked the fire department. Find yourself a fire station and ask the fire department. They will tell you, they will print you out a map. Even back in my day, they had, more sophisticated equipment than the industry did. They would print you out a map of where to go, or they would at least tell you how to go there, especially on a truck route, because they, again, one thing, say go to the police department. Well, not always. A lot of policemen only know their little area, but the fire department has to know where everywhere is. Plus, they drive large equipment like we do. So that's one of the best things that you can do if you find yourself stuck, especially if you're in a smaller city. But in a bigger city, it's always represented on a map. You cannot rely too much on a GPS, because a GPS is a satellite signal, and sometimes those signals get interrupted or clouded, and it might put you on the wrong path. So it's always good to read a map. Plus, it's a good safety device to have in case for whatever reason your GPS stops working and you can't get anywhere to get another one or get it fixed. So it's not something you should rely on. You should be able to, it should be required to be able to read a map, because it's still relevant even today.
Yes, I agree, and I have the same argument with some of the newer guys. They don't need a map because they got GPS, so forth and so on. That's why I figured I would ask you, because I know, like I said, when I started, there were no GPSs. We had to rely on a map. If you couldn't read a map, you were lost. There were no two ways about it. Now, some of the other little tendencies, like the trucks that you drove when you first started driving compared to the trucks today. I don't know if you ever drove any 2 or 3 stick trucks, but I know the rides were different, the suspensions were different. Cab overs were a big part of the over-the-road trucking industry, unless you were an independent owner-operator back then. Touch on some of the advancements in the trucking, the equipment compared to what you used to drive.
Well, you know, my first truck that I drove was a 1962 Peterbilt cab over with, if you'll believe it, and this was, back then, this was a luxury of appointment. It had a shock absorber in the driver's seat, and the passenger seat was just like this chair right here. It was just fixed to the floor. So, you know, woe to the guy that was the lumper or the swamper, you know. He had the worst ride even than the driver. The driver didn't have much better of a ride. It's just that whenever you hit a big bump, it's just so much of there's this thing. It's like a shock wave, and you feel it when you hit a big bump at high speed and you're in one of those old cab overs. Other than that, if the road was smooth, it wasn't bad. If you had a load, it was worse when you were empty. But yeah, I had my time that summer in the cab overs, and I'm glad that we've come a long way since then. I'll tell you that. You know, could I have done it back then? Well, we asked ourselves that, and you know, yes, you could have, because if that's what you wanted to do, that's what you were driving. You were, you know, basically, like I said, you were given the keys, and there's a truck, and you know, there was no complaining about it. we complain of our air conditioning's not working, which, you know, believe me, that summer I didn't have any air conditioning, but I learned how to adapt. I learned real quick to go to the night shift.
Yes, yes, my AC's not working in my truck right now. I know that. I know that real well. Well, this has been
not to be demeaning or anything. I just wanted to mention that because I know that's important to us now. You know,
yes,
because it's a comfort feature that it makes you less fatigued. Let's put it that way. Because believe me, it lasted all of about 2 days when I worked in the daytime.
Well, we've gone on for a little while. We've touched on some things. Hopefully, I'll be able to interview you again in the future to add on to this.
I was just having fun.
Oh, I know.
Get my opinions out.
No, I know, and like I said, I would like to continue to do multiple interviews with multiple different people. You know, come up in shorter segments, so I'm not hitting the viewers with the same old opinion, but for on and on and on. I'm trying to keep my videos a little short, so we will be doing another video soon, probably next time I come in the house. But one of the things I'd like to end on is, at this point, what advice would you give someone who is looking into joining the trucking field, whether it be because they've been laid off, or whether it's because it's something they've always dreamed about doing, or, you know, no matter the situation why they're coming into our industry, what advice would you give them, and what warning would you give them?
Well, the one thing that I would do is I would find something that, you know, first of all, is going to satisfy, you know, the time you're going to need to be at home. Because even if you're a local driver, there's going to be times when you're away for 2 or 3 days at a time, just because you've been sent off to another city and you might get stuck there. You know, you might have to stay in a hotel there because the shipper wasn't ready, or say your truck broke down and you're in a shop. You never know. So even a job considered local, you could be gone overnight or longer. So it has to be something that fits your family situation, whether you're single, a student, you know, married, you know, whatever, you know, with kids, without kids, you know, it has to be something that, you know, because it's like they say, if mom ain't happy, nobody's happy. And if you're not happy, well, you know, then I guess you're not happy. You have to find something that fits you. And second of all, you've got to find the one that pays the highest. The pay scales vary from, people still pay 30 cents a mile to where there are some companies that start you at 52 cents a mile. But you have to do your homework on these companies, just like they're doing a background check on you. You got to make sure that this company that, you know, you've seen, maybe look on a site where they've had good reviews or not so good reviews. Ask OOIDA. You know, ask OOIDA, is this a good, you know, the Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association. Join that. It's only $45 a year. They actually are the only organization in this country that fights for the rights of truckers, whether they're owner-operators or not. It doesn't require you to be an owner-operator, but you have to have someone in your corner that's going to give you good advice. And try to seek out people that are experienced and that won't tell you a big bunch of, you know, a big bunch of fish stories, you know, because they're out there. I mean, no 5 drivers can agree on anything. That's why nobody will ever go protest in Washington, D.C. over these working conditions. But the one thing that there's very good experienced hands out there like me and like my friend Mark here that will give you, you know, the straight talk, because that's what you need. And the third of all, what was the last question that you asked me?
To give them, I asked
what they wouldn't do.
Yeah, well, give them something to look for at, i.e., you give them good advice about finding about pay and home time and selling that. Well, give them some advice on what they should look for as far as the bad companies, because there are bad companies out there that will lie to you, or they'll tell you, oh yeah, we'll have you home here. Give them some advice, you know, as far as what to look for on that aspect too, because you gotta remember, some of these viewers have never been in the industry. They haven't talked to the snake oil salesmen, recruiters that there are out there, because most recruiters are just as bad as used car salesmen.
Yeah, they're slick talkers, and they want to get you in the door. And once you're in the door and you're dependent on them for your income, well, if you're stuck sitting 2 or 3 days somewhere and your check has gone down the tubes that week, well, what are you going to do? You know, you're going to have to come all the way back home, quit. All your bills are going to get behind. So that's how they get you. They get you in, like I said, like they say on, you know, like the fish story, they get you in on a hook and they keep you there. But there are good, honest companies out there, and you can tell that just by what they offer. I'll give you a perfect example. Martin, I mean, they're unbelievable, because that company is still run by a trucker's son. See, a lot of companies are run by either college graduates or some company that's bought out this company, and they're just a holding company. They don't have any idea of what the lifestyle of a trucker is. They just see dollars and cents. And there's websites, there's review sites, there's all kinds of tools that you got nowadays, speaking of technology, that you can look and see what the reviews are, and you can see people give their opinion of them. And you know, again, two opinions are going to be different. One person's going to say, I've seen these, I do this now. When I look for a company, I see one person say they were the best company ever, and I see one person don't go to work for them. So, and you still have to make up your own mind, you know, and you have the freedom of choice. There are 1,000 trucking companies out there, but there's probably only 100 good ones. There's thousands of trucking companies, but there really are probably about only 100 good ones, you know. And you can even go union if you want. I mean, we have our differences of opinion on unions, but it's still a good way to go. I mean, politics aside, you know, union politics aside, I've talked to a lot of guys that have done that, and they've done very well for themselves. But it's also not easy to join that, you know, and there's very limited positions open. That's why you see more over-the-road non-union positions open than you do union positions.
All right. Well, I appreciate you let me take the time and kind of pick your brain a little bit. Like I said, we'll be doing more of these in the near future. We're gonna have to go in here and edit this here pretty soon so we can get this up on the site. I'm sure the viewers appreciate your time. And once again, this is Mark Bennett. Thank you for coming to the YouTube channel. Please subscribe and leave all comments at the bottom. Thank you.